There it is.
Great.
Okay, so now?
Yeah.
All right. Welcome to the seminar, everyone. Thank you for being here and coming in person. And for those of you who are joining us online, thanks for doing that too. I want to look over here to Sean, who's like doing the online thing, but if you're online, it's better if yeah. So we're really excited to welcome Cleo for our third seminar of this series. Sort of thinking into, so technically this is an environmental justice seminar series that we do in the fall. And the title of our seminar series this year is thinking about emotional resilience and sort of grappling with emotional resilience in a time of ecological grief. And so Cleo is the third in a magnificent lineup of speakers, and Cleo comes to us from the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs, where he works. And I have gotten to know Cleo over the past few years, and it's just been a wonderful thing to get to know Cleo. And Cleo has come out and visited on the farm a couple of times, so we've had a chance to just hang out in the evenings and talk about things. And I found the opportunity to talk to Cleo just like super meaningful to me, to think creatively about the work of conservation, the work of an ecologist, and our lives as ecologists have gone in really different spaces. And Cleo works in freshwater environments, and in my own life as an ecologist, I'm mostly just a practicing farmer using ecology as that sort of framework on which I practice that agriculture. And still, there's an enormous amount of creative thinking and space that emerges for me every time I get the opportunity to talk with Cleo. So I'm super glad to welcome Cleo to our seminar today. He's going to be talking on the title of Grieving Queerly, Exploring Conservation Work and Non-Human Kinship, which I just can't wait for. Also, Cleo wrote a book, which I want to tell you about. It's called Underflows, and I'm really enjoying it. Each chapter sort of begins with like personal explorations and thinking about ideas, and then thinking about thinking into how to practice those ideas at work in collaborative ecosystem science. So really great, absolutely recommend it. I was going to read to you from it, but I think I won't, and I'll just let Cleo start. Cleo, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Eli. I'm curious to hear later what you would have read.
If we have time, I'll read it.
Okay. Well, I'm going to read a little bit too. So, yeah. If I can get this to work. Oh no, it was working and now it's not working.
Do you think the YouTube did?
That's okay. I can just do. Oh, no, that's not what you did. Oh, no, I didn't think that's version.
Your cursor is moving.
Yeah, if you're on the Zoom, you're looking at the Zoom. Your screen.
That's what I thought.
I can do something if you want.
Yeah, I think you go back to your PowerPoint.
Keep it not to share it again. You guys can see that on the screen now? Yeah. Oh, but it's not posted. Yeah, it'll work. There you go. All right. So, thank you, Eli, for introducing my book, Underflows, Queer Trans Ecologies and River Justice. So, I encourage you to check it out. I'll be reading from some parts of this book. And just wanted to begin by situating us and my work, both in space and in relation to the landscape and to Native nations. So this is a map that Justine Velasco made as part of her master's of landscape architecture thesis. See if we're putting the links. No, so I'm gonna put it in my hand. So this is where we are. So Seattle, the Puget Lowlands, and Josine was kind of using this white oak or Gary oak landscape as a connective idea through the Willamette Valley and down to the Klamath Mountain Range, where they did the other part of their work with me in my lab and my collaborators here in the Klamath River Basin near Tishanik is the Cuttick name. So yeah, just to acknowledge that here we are in Coast Salish lands, shared lands and waters of Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, Suquamish nations, and that we can, as we're here and benefiting from living on these lands, be thinking about how to give back through our work, through our money, through our labor in some cases to these people. And then a lot of my work that I do down here in this area is in Cuttick ancestral territory and with the Quartzstraw Valley Indian Reservation, which is also probably right under that dot. And so that's a little bit of location for some of the stuff you're doing here. And then some of my earlier work happened down here, right just north of the San Francisco Bay Area in Salmon Creek, which is Pomo and Miwok territory. So this is the Klamath River, and it flows from Oregon down through Northern California, through territory of 9 different tribes, and it was an intensive site of mining. And so up one of these tributaries is the Scott Valley, and this is where Underflows begins. So I'm going to read you from the preface. We follow a beaver dug canal up into the maze of tailings, then scramble up the steep cobble slope. From shivering in deep shade, we're blasted by sun and waves of heat radiating off the barren rock. At the tailings crest, the main stem of the river stretches out. The trickle that is Sugar Creek below brush dams sinks quickly into the dry bed. In the far distance, sprinklers pivot over bright green alfalfa fields lined by irrigation ditches, brimming with quick, clear flow. Several miles downstream, the stream surfaces again and a few hardy coho fry wade out the dry summer's end. The tailings play tricks with perspective in space, but also in time. Gold dredges operated here for a few decades in a 1930s revival of frontier gold rush fantasies. Dredge tailings obliterated the floodplain's tangled braid of shifting channels and rerouted underflows that fed the river during the long dry summer. These landforms will likely persist for millennia, only gradually softening and reconfiguring in once-in-a-century floods. Nonetheless, salmon, birds, and beavers, among other creatures, make their lives here and show unlikely coalitions of humans how to work with the river in a different way. Many of the ranchers who have rights to divert the river's surface and underflows to their fields consider contemporary property and regulatory regimes as permanent as the tailings. The Cuttick tribe and Quartz Valley Indian community see both as ready for transformation, not back to a pre-European settlement state, but into a new regime that allows salmon to return abundantly. With the Watershed Council and numerous other partners, the Cuttick tribe makes political moves through fieldwork reciprocity within and outside of their ancestral territory. They and other Klamath River tribes work on behalf of salmon that swim through their territories to spawn here in Scott Valley, which holds the best coho habitat in the entire Klamath Basin. Their multifaceted natural resource programs asserts territorial sovereignty across lands currently held by the Forest Service and exercises treaty rights to co-manage fisheries beyond those territories. From their perspective, property and water regimes must and will change so that water can flow across floodplains and percolate down, later upwelling cool water into pools where coho and steelhead fry go fat. Think for a moment of floodplains as amphibious, brought into being and constantly recreated and transformed by interactions among water, sediment, and numerous species, including beavers, willows, cottonwoods, and humans. Beavers iconically create and co-create amphibious landscapes, waterscapes that remix patterns of wet and dry and support floodplain ecosystems in which a multitude of human and non-human watershed inhabitants can also live amphibiously. Large dams and waterworks have had the opposite aim of beavers, to separate water from land and river channels from their floodplains. to extirpate marshy indeterminacy and replace it with productive irrigated farmland and efficient channel networks for flood control. Yet for whom are such infrastructures and logics sufficient and productive? Indigenous peoples in the Pacific West engineered river mouths to let salmon upstream and modified watershed hydrology by strategically blending the uplands and riparian corridors. Such engineering profoundly transformed river ecology to favor culturally important species like salmon and fiber plants that grow in seeps and along sandbars. Settler colonial water engineers in the late 19th and 20th centuries misrecognized these native engineered swamps, marshes, and floodplains as wastelands. Most were blind to or simply didn't value the promiscuous ecological productivity of amphibious landscapes. Recent collaborative experiments with beavers, such as these ones, the Scott River Watershed Council's experiments at the Sugar Creek Scott River confluence, open up unorthodox ways of understanding and managing rivers and agricultural landscapes as productive, not for capitalist extraction, but for fish, birds, and riparian forests. Such politics inhere in the beautiful and troubled rivers, like the Scott and Klamath. These rivers' ceaseless call and response of flood and low flows beckon salmon into ever-changing improvisation of outmigration and return. Into struggles along these rivers, this book invites river workers and those who love rivers to attune to their unruly and hidden flows and to enter into this always improvisatory work of transfiguring. So that's the very beginning. And I'm gonna kind of go back and forth between reading and then just talking about some pictures. So the book is partly in feminist science studies, which is more of a humanities field, and then it's partly drawing on science. So the talk is a bit of a mix of the disciplines as well. And you can see here, this is a beaver dam that has a bunch of posts in it. So it's called a Beaver Dam Analog, and it was built by humans, but then beavers came in and like fixed it up and made it a little bit better. And this was before they put those beaver dams in. There's one there and one back there. This is Charna Edwards, who's the director of the Scott River Watershed Council. And these are some of my students who are studying beavers there. Before that came in, this would go totally dry in the summer. And now it's a pond that it's like you literally have to swim in some parts. And the water in the floodplain has risen at like a half mile out from the river. And all these willows have grown up. So all this is a result of like this beaver collaboration with humans. So now I'm going to talk a little bit from the introduction, which was called Water's Invitation, about this kind of queer. So I introduced a little bit of indigenous and settler history, and now thinking about queer and trans ecologies of rivers. Oh yeah, but first I can show you a little bit more. So this is zooming into the Klamath Basin. It starts in Oregon, goes down through California, and this is Scott Valley here. And then this is Tishonik, and these are Lisa Moorhead-Hellman and Lee Tillman, who are my two co-PIs on a lot of these projects down in the river. So, and this is Sciendorf, so I think rivers matter for queer trans life. Rivers have long been places of encounter for those outside of straight settler propriety. They are brown in the way that José Esteban Munoz describes, quote, the way in which they suffer and strive together, but also the commonality of their ability to flourish under duress and pressure. They smolder with life and persistence. Queer trans people make joyous moves of solidarity when we swim in rivers and splash along other shorelines, to wear what we like to the beach, to see and support one another, to be admired in our bodies without apology. Such everyday acts of life, love, and dreaming big transgress our norms of sexuality and family, and require uprising and political transformation. So I wrote this in 2020. During a pandemic year, as police violence and federal inaction amplified suffering in Black and Brown communities, Black trans matriarch Zion Taylor shouted, "We want to live" from the stage at the 2020 March for Black Trans Lives. Diane told the 10,000 supporters gathered in Brooklyn for trans and queer people, especially those most marginalized by whiteness and settler colonialism. Quote, society has never given us our rewards nor dealt with our debts in a way where we felt held. Rivers can become spaces to practice these political transformations and transgressions in that everyday. And so in the book, I'm making this argument of like across queer and trans strategy and indigenous and environmental justice movements. And so I'm saying that if we can have, there already are alliances kind of in the political sphere between these movements, but those don't necessarily show up in river science and policy. And so I'm trying to argue from different perspectives, like why people who care about rivers, river scientists, river workers might want to take on some tactics from indigenous, Black, brown, and other radical traditions in which, as we know, queer, trans, and two-spirit people have always played key roles. So I'm not going to read it all right now, but we talked a lot about why that might be a good idea. And within the realm of environmental politics, I'm focusing specifically on ecological science and the relations among species and earth processes that ecology studies. And I'm thinking about how can queer trans thought and queer trans life influence both the science of ecology and the ecologies, right, or multi-species communities that we think of as ecosystems. And so I'll read a little bit from the chapters where one of the things I'm arguing is that queer and trans people's experiences of grieving premature death from police and intimate violence, AIDS, suicide, and exclusion from healthcare and economic opportunity has, right, in our movement, stoked collective action. And this could translate into action on extinction and ecological damage. And then other chapters I'm not going to read to you from today, I'm showing how trans people's experiences of transfiguring our bodies and social relations could model a new way for river ecologists and who might not be queer or trans to embrace dynamism and unpredictability, which rivers and their ecosystems always display. So I'm gonna so part of what is important in these academic books, as you all know, right, is to define some of your terms. So some of the terms that I am working with and trying to expand their definitions are queer, trans, and then this queer trans feminist as like what is queer trans feminist ecology and restoration. And so in thinking about queerness, I'm thinking about, right, queer, like wanting that to remain grounded in queer lives and queer politics, but also thinking about more broadly about kinship and ways that people might extend kinship like we make in our queer communities across other species. And in the trans definition, I'm thinking about all of these different kind of etymological roots of trans, crossing, traversing, transfiguring, right? And thinking about transformations that our landscapes are undergoing and how can we understand them differently through kind of trans theories of embodiment. And then in this one, in the queer trans feminist, for those of you who do statistics, if you're coding something in R, that X would show like an interaction term, right? So it's really like, what is the interaction, right, between queer and trans and feminist, like not only them being kind of squished together, but as they're influencing one another, like what does this give to a practice of science? And then in restoration, really challenging some of the ideas of that are maybe dominant in kind of settler restoration of restoring to an ideal state or to a point in the past or to a point that doesn't include human management, and really thinking about other words like rehabilitation or adding ecocultural to restoration to think about what is possible, right, given the landscapes that we have and the people that live there and the ways that people make their livelihoods there. And this is one of the performances that I talk about. I'm not going to talk about it today, but it's a slapstick musical about salmon migration that takes place in a casino, and there's a water nymph who kind of faces off with this water tycoon. So this is like, you can read about it, and it's like this is the core one of the core like objects of analysis. And so, you know, I'm asking what politics of solidarity can queer trans feminist tactics bring into river science and management? How might queer and trans modes of relation among and beyond the human reshape science and governance along rivers? And how might taking science and field practice seriously as a grounds for queer and trans ecological thought reshape queer, trans, and environmental studies? And so this work is rooted a lot in my own grounding and training as an ecologist. And so this was some work that I did in Salmon Creek near San Francisco Bay. And I'll just read a little bit about like what ways of seeing that I got from this training. This might be familiar to some of you who are also ecologists. When I go to a river, to the Klamath, the Stillaguamish, the Duwamish, the Sacramento, the Umpqua, or their tributary streams, I sense the river as a constantly shifting presence that takes form from specific, yet also constantly shifting physical, social, and psychic forces. I first began training in and interpreting these land water histories while staking rocks and digging swales on a stream restoration crew. Later training in ecology let me see the ecological relations among the organisms that live in streams and the adjacent riparian zone. In one sense, the river is water's rhythms and flows in flood and drought, with the surface flows and the flows underneath. And you can see here, I'm like looking at the river with people. So a lot of my work was with local residents and looking at how their own household water use was influencing these really small dry streams that host a lot of salmon and steelhead juveniles. So in another sense, the river is the infrastructures and policies that amplify, diminish, or divert river flows. Considering a river this way reveals it as a socio-technical system of interacting political and social forces that shape those flows. These forces include property regimes, regulations, management policies, incentives, rules, and tacit norms of use. So if we consider water governance as a conceptual river, then the surface flows are the settler sciences, policies, infrastructures, and institutions that govern and direct river and water management. And then the underflows, you could learn to sense these political and social underflows by studying resistance to top-down management. So the ways that Native nations and marginalized communities contest property doctrines and laws that legitimize harms to the watershed, right? Like groundwater overdraft, that legitimize floodplain discretion, and then also that interrogate scientific results with indigenous and land-based knowledges. So I go on to talk in the chapter that I'm mainly going to focus on today about fieldwork. And so I did a lot of catching salmon and measuring water quality. This is electrofishing with a backpack electrofisher with my lab mate, Suzanne Kelson. And I'm going to read a little bit about field time, and then I'll move into the grief stuff. And I really don't have that much time, so I'm just going to read a little bit of this. Field time is an open-ended time. Scientists switch modes when rain, spawning, bloom, or a drop in temperature signal that time to head to the field. Same as when cruising for sets, you'll miss out if you don't know where or when to be. En route, in cars and boats or on trails, we speculate about broader questions and patterns of research, much more wildly than in any formal talk or paper. But once we reach the site, such talk stops. We pause to describe an organism's identifying characteristics. This methodical attention makes for precise, even painstaking measurement. At times, we fall into a rhythm, each to one's allotted task, moving together with practice, almost rote movement. Yet this rhythm is not a factory strict clock time. In the field, there's time for distraction. A fish biologist admires a snake crossing the road, and an entomologist tracks birdsong. Once, a botanist friend recording fish counts filled the margins of my data sheet with Latin names of plants. Our love for the field's multiplicity exceeds quantification. In the metaphorical river of underflows, we are beneath the surface of the gravel, cruising the hyperread zone, while doing the part of science that is not seen in published papers, but wells up into the surface in conference talks, in jokes or field self-portraits. And I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, but I talk about the toll that fieldwork takes on our bodies and use some Ellen Samuel's 6 ways of looking at crypt time to think about ways that crypting time is meaningful in the field. We can talk about that more later. Being trans or queer in the field, like being Black, brown, indigenous, or female, carries risks of violence and exclusion. Such positionalities can lead to different choices for field sites, human collaborators, and ways of relating with organisms that disrupt colonial practices of field science. Black people, indigenous people, and people of color in environmental sciences have pushed for new research agendas that focused on racialized communities' environmental engagements, on urban environments, and on racist policies. So I'm talking here about environmental justice studies and movements. These scholars often foreground queer and feminist tactics to do this work, sometimes making alliances with white and settler scientists to create supportive spaces within our labs and professional societies. Their most crucial function is to make scientific work survivable for we who feel otherwise. So then in the rest of this chapter, I use a strategy from Gloria Anzaldúa in Light in the Dark, Luz en lo Oscuro. She writes these autohistorias, so they're like self-story, self-histories. And so I travel to an ecology conference where I'm watching a yellow warbler researcher talk about her species going extinct, and I'm thinking about these baby fish that I'm watching die at my study site, and I'm describing that the bodily feelings that she's transmitting and that I'm feeling, and thinking about how all of this feeling like has no place right in the paper. Like we all have these feelings for our species, but how do we write about them, like in a research paper or even in a class paper? And so then around this same time, this is all in 2014, when there's a really deep drought on all of these California streams. And this is me learning how to catch fish, my mentor, Michael Fawcett, where I'm hanging out.
You have a lot less gray hair.
I know, and a lot more hair too. And I thought I had so much then. At the same time, yeah, and this is how we weigh the fish and measure them. We knock them out with Alka-Seltzer, so they're like kind of floating, not and all of this, yeah, it's like, and then they recover, and it seems like it doesn't hurt them too much, but who knows, right? And this is one of these fish that was actually dead. And so when I was snorkeling, I wasn't actually catching fish on this day, but you can see how the water is almost black, or it looks black, but it actually is black because there was such low oxygen that cyanobacteria bloomed in this water and kind of made it be almost opaque and black. And this was at this point I had been going every summer and measuring the flows every 2 weeks and measuring the oxygen, measuring the depth and counting the fish. This is the first time that I had seen this. It was kind of 3 years into a 5-year drought. And so I was really kind of grappling with, wow, these fish are already so marginal, right, in their existence in the stream, and just a little bit less water turns it into extinction, right? Or what Deborah Bird was called double death, right? And it's very rare to find, this is a dead juvenile coho, it's very rare to find them because usually a raccoon or something will eat whatever. So the fact that I found one meant that there was a lot of them that were dying. And so this is the kind of grounding for this next autohistoria, which I'll read for you. It's just called My Dead Cutie. In late August, my lab mate, Mike Logan, an aquatic entomologist and well-networked Twitter user, is rooting for Team Benthos in a cutoff. Benthos are the little bugs that crawl around on the bottom of the stream. The rules, so this is like a Twitter thing called cutoff. The rules, original photos only, and you must say why you're studying organism. I post some stills of baby salmon that I took in June while swimming through a deep pool teeming with coho and steelhead fry. Over the next weeks, the photos flood in on this Twitter thing. Most of the animals are small or big-eyed. Many of the small ones, bugs, frogs, snails, perch on a person's finger and nestle in their hand. The scientists who post also speculate. What makes them so cute? Their small vulnerability, their big infantile eyes. Other photos of sharks, elephants, and slime molds are neither small nor traditionally cute, but my researchers argue for their inclusion nonetheless. These images of a researcher and an elephant, oh wait, do I have my dead cutie ones? I don't have them, sorry. I have them somewhere, they're not in, I have lots of these photos. These images of a researcher and an elephant entwined in the water are smiling scientists tightly hugging a toothy baby shark, transpose traditional gestures of human intimacy onto strange intimates. Many non-scientists who comment on the post seem surprised by this outpouring of love from scientists, even within the limits of cuteness. A queer aesthetic when applied to slime mold. Scientists call it cutoff, a victory of science communication. But I wonder, what is being communicated through these images? What is being said? How is it being heard? And what affects are passing from person to person as the photos and characters fly across the ether? The trope of cuteness seems to be a deliberate rejection of doom and gloom environmentalism, which has, in recent years, fallen out of favor as a way to convince the public to conserve biodiversity or to fight climate change. Yet in excising these doomsday narratives, a space from mourning the double death of human-driven extinctions is also cut off. But perhaps not. The response by non-scientists suggests a shared recognition in cuteness of something worth looking at and worth posting about. I read this response as a kind of anticipatory nostalgia for cute biodiverse field worlds. So far from Twitter users screen-bound time. And then I talk about, finding this image and just how it is to be swimming through this super stinky water and like getting it in my wetsuit and like, you know, thinking about all the dead things that are in it and just some of these moments of being in the field where just, oh, why am I doing this? It's so crazy. And Suzanne and I are talking about these salmon in this year of extreme drought, and she says they're so small and skinny compared to the streams we survey further north. They're just losing weight in these small pools. Because of the drought, the stream stopped flowing a month earlier than usual, and it's been months since the fish's bug prey drifted downstream. In responding to the single salmon death, Suzanne seems curious and slightly wistful, as if she's seeing the liveliness still, the kind of sadness of the lost possibility of smolting, ocean swimming, and a chance at spawning. But alongside sadness at that individual fish's death, we both wonder how other species responded to that small body, how nutrient cycles might shift in that pool with the addition of its carbon and nitrogen, or fascinated as ecologists with the relations that these deaths and drought revealed. We wonder, you know, why did they stay in this pool? Why did they choose this pool rather than another one? Mixed with grief, I feel in the sense that Suzanne feels some joy in that messy life and death that drives adaptation and selection. This drive, these little fish are cute, sure, but they're fierce too, and they remind us why we fight for them with defiant, glittering gestures. So I pick up one dead silver body and photograph it, thinking to post it to the Twitter cutoff. The silver fish body in my hand reproduces the setup of the cutoff, only instead of a circuit of aliveness between you know, a hand and a creature, the dead fish is still not slimy, it weighs almost nothing. This lively cuteness of the live fish is bound up with grief and mourning. Their youthful exuberance is all the more poignant because their lives are cut short. But saying this publicly on Twitter especially with the hashtag of my dead cutie, seems a transgression of something unspoken about loss or breaching of the particular affective circuit of fish and human in the fields. So I don't post the photos. It's just like, how can I? This doesn't fit right in that cute off. And so these Alpha-Storia sections alternate with a bunch of theory, which I'm not going to read to you, but I'm talking about using Taganyongo's and Jose Munoz's ideas about weighting as a queer practice and what is queer about weighting, and talk about some of the temporalities of field time, how we are repeating, we're visiting the same place again and again, and what is kind of happening in this revisiting. And so in the end, I come to this, which is a performance called Teletanian Troubles. So as in the same summer where I'm standing Twitter with my phone in and out in the field with Suzanne, I'm wondering what other scientists, and especially other queer scientists, would say to the salmon that they're seeing in the field as they're dying, right? If they thought that they could communicate to the salmon, if they thought that the salmon could respond. I wonder what would happen if scientists could speak their love and grief to their beloved species in view of one another, yet in intimate relation to the salmon. What would they say, and how would that saying affect them? So me and a group of artists and scientists called the Water Underground made this performance piece called Teletanian Troubles. And so the setup, and we did it at the California Bay Delta Science Conference and the Forest Conference and a queer art show called, I forget what it was called. And the setup was someone would be wearing the salmon mask and sometimes dressed in like a shimmery outfit. And then we had these rocks that had little messages on the bottom of them. And then we had someone who would be walking around, the conference hall saying, hey, come do it, tell us your troubles. And then someone would come up and sit down and they would start talking to the salmon. The salmon would turn over these rocks, which had messages on the bottom of them. And then the person would respond either by writing or by talking. And we had a recorder where we were recording what people said, and we're saying, we're going to take what you said and we're going to play it back to the salmon in the river. Or if you write something, we'll take what you write and like put it in the river and see what the salmon has to say. So this was the setup. And some of the stones said, one of them said, describe a place that you love that no longer exists. One of them said, are you troubled by your data? One of them said, what would you change to save from extinction? And one of them, which was everyone's favorite, said, do you like to swim? And so people would answer, right? And sometimes they would get really sad talking about their data. And then when she turned over the do you like to swim stone, and the salmon can't talk, because fish can't talk, right? But they can turn over a rock and they can kind of make swimming motions. So they say, oh, salmon, I love to swim. And you could talk about how much they love to swim. So, yeah, so when the salmon person was moving, right, they're just kind of moving like this, but many of the participants would interpret those gestures as a response and kind of say, you can keep talking, right? Like the way that you're nodding, someone might keep talking. So there was, at the first conference, there was 400 ecologists there, and about 40 of them actually sat down and talked to the salmon, and some of them stayed for half an hour and said, hey, you have salmon, you have to come down to the poster hall. I want to show you my poster. The art shows was like, salmon, I want to show you my spawn. Like, here's my teenagers. I brought them to meet you. So people got really into talking to the salmon. And I'm just gonna, and then we took the responses and a canoe to the Casumis River and delivered them to the salmon by reading them, playing voice recordings underwater, and dragging written messages behind our canoe. So now I'm going to talk a little bit, just theorizing from this experience. Can radical queer trans feminist analysis contribute to movements that extend solidarity across species boundaries, by elaborating a critique of human nature binaries, to see fish and other creatures as making demands based on difference that will not assimilate, that's from Munoz, to settler river control, is one such move that expands the concerns of queer ecological inquiry. The social scientist in me wants to know, did this paper salmon affect the other humans? In asking this question, as one of the people who wore the salmon head, I'm no longer just a human social scientist. Me, the scientist inside this fish head, has been transformed in some way, and now must know what's happening to the other scientists and queers who are co-creating this performance. So at times, while I was being the salmon, I felt the dead baby salmon from my field site swimming through the paper salmon to open a space for the scientist to feel this grief and express this grief. So I wonder if they felt that grief, did the experience make space for them to change anything about their practice of science? So then, I'm a social scientist. I'm like, oh, I could answer these questions. I could conduct an interview, a series of interviews as this paper salmon, either live on Twitter or in a marathon live performance at the next Space Out to Science conference. And I could use a whole new set of questions on different stones. So I never do this, but this is just my imagination, right? And set up for the social science. So I'll close by reading these questions, and then we'll have some time for your questions. So preliminary thoughts towards further stone questions. What organisms or ecological processes do you study? What makes your study organisms cute? What makes it lovable? How do you describe your feelings for your study organism? Do you love it? Do you feel a sense of kinship with it? Do you think individuals of this species are dying a premature death? Who or what is responsible for this? Does it need to be saved? Who must save it? Do they love it? If you could tell a member of this species about your worries or fears for your future relations, what would you say? Do you ever speak out loud or write to this creature? Has it ever responded? How? Is your love for this organism erotic? Are you out to your friends and family about this love? Are you out to your scientific colleagues? If you confess this love, would you be transgressing any boundaries? Do your study methods interrogate your response to the salmon and its response to you? And if you said no, what would your next study look like if you considered the salmon's response and your response to the salmon? What would you risk with this kind of study? And then as social scientists, we always have to ask them kind of situating questions. So then asking, are you queer? Are you trans? Are you a scientist? And so I'll end there. And thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.
I'm sure there's a ton of questions. I promise to let other people go first.
I have a lot of pocket effects too. If you guys want to see pictures of it. Y'all have some? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. What was your highlight of doing like research on like in the field? Like, what was your takeaway?
I mean, when I was doing all that stuff, but I was almost always by myself. And so it was just like, I think just the way you can like observe things, like with the things that you notice, like going again and again, and like the season changing, and it's like the smell of the land, but I also would go out a lot with citizen scientists. So there's a watershed council, and they became like my adopted grandmas. Like they would like bake me cookies and like bring me their homemade cheese, and we would hang out at their house and like work on our data sheets. So that was really just so cool too, to like people who, they live there, so they go on walks every day and they see all this stuff that I'm never gonna see coming out even once every 2 weeks. And so yeah, being able to kind of build those relationships and really get to know like a lot of different kinds of people from a lot of different political standpoints, but who are all kind of caring about the salmon, even though some of them are also ranchers and also care about their cows. And so just, I think having that, it's such a luxury when you do PhD because you get to go out somewhere if you're doing the field of science for like several years and just get to know it so intimately. And so both the human and the non-human, but that's a really good question. Thanks to think about that. Yeah.
What is the main argument or theme that runs through your book?
So this idea of underflows is like there's different underflows. So I talked a little bit about, there's just the river and then the water that is in the gravel that you can't see, right? And then there's kind of like the mainstream politics and all this other like politics from below. And then thinking through some of the queer and trans and indigenous theories, there's these kind of subversive relations, right? Of like, can you love another species? Like, can you think of them as family? How would we act if we really thought that? Or what if there's a whole chapter that's kind of around, more around queer kinship and looking at the act of protest where people are having funerals in the streets or their beloved kin, and what if we were doing that for species that are going extinct? Like, how would that shift like conservation and environmental movement? So, I think that the thinking with these underflows, right, that whatever you like look at, it will have a surface flow and underflow. And so like thinking in like these latent possibilities, especially when the like dominant narrative is often so depressing, and it's like, what are we supposed to do? There's like no space to move in policy or in climate, and yet like there's all these other tendencies that keep going, right? And all these local I got to check the chat, sorry. All these local instances, right, of people really making beautiful things in the midst of extreme rapid change and hardship. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna track 1, 2, and then someone back there. 4. Okay.
So I told you millions of
Yeah,
questions.
awesome. I'll try to be briefer so I can get more of yours. Maybe I'll take like 2 or 3 questions and not answer because I talk a lot. Okay.
Yeah, so I really like this concept of just like this aspect of mourning
Mhm.
species loss, and kind of like in correlation to that question that just popped up right now. Do you think that this aspect of just honoring the loss of these species would also give more so of a broader welcoming environment to also like people of color and indigenous communities to also share their history of how they've also built sustainable relationships within this type of like practice?
Yeah, totally. And I think that, when I'm thinking with indigenous theory and indigenous communities, I have a long-term collaboration in the Klamath with Lisa Leaf, who I showed you pictures of, and a lot of other people there for like 11 years now. And so a lot of it was like, listening to indigenous relationality or some of the stuff from Black studies around relationality and being like, okay, so as a white settler, like that's not really mine to use, but in my own kind of queer culture, queer theory, like we have other things that are like resonant with that can make solidarity with that. And so, and that are like a little different than that too, right? And so it's like looking at like this multiplicity of, but the common thread is like, lives that are not seen as grievable, right, within the dominant, because the people or other than human beings are not seen as like fully worthy, right? And so that's like this space where like many people can relate. And so then bringing forward all those traditions is totally essential. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I lost track. 1, yeah.
I really like the tell your son, or like tell the salmon your trouble idea, because I think it was cool to think about like bridging the gap between like data collection and like scientific method and like trying to figure out all of these environmental things, but also bringing in like the emotional side of it, because like you were talking about like grieving species and like just the environment in general, like dealing with all of that. I thought it was really cool. So I was just wondering like what the inspiration, I guess, was behind like that specific idea or like mode to like get people to talk about their like emotions or feelings about their species, or like about the salmon too.
Yeah, so we had that salmon head. You might have noticed it was the same salmon head from the play. So we just have it around. And so we're like, what can we do with the salmon head? But I don't remember exactly. It just was in my mind of like, okay, I was going every week and watching these fish die, and I like counted them all the time, so I knew how many were dying. And then we had been invited to do something at the Big Delta Science Conference, and I don't know, I think I was just lying in bed at night, and he's like thinking about like a confessional, like a confession booth, and then he's like, oh no, it'd be better if it was in public and people could actually see it. And then then I talked to my collaborators about it, and somehow it came out. But yeah, I was just somewhere in that, like, thinking around about extinction, and then thinking about how scientists never get to talk about their feelings. And like, well, maybe they would talk to the salmon because it's so kind of ridiculous. But then, and some people did think it was ridiculous, and they'd be like, salmon, I'm worried about my mortgage. I'm like, the salmon does not care about your mortgage. But then other people, yeah, it left them like, think about that in a different way. So
Thank you.
so yes.
Well, I have a question because I know that writing a book is like a crazy process,
Mhm.
and I was curious about that, but more so like what got like left out or what the, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard when you're writing a book because people want you to like publish stuff all the time, and when you're writing a book, you're like holding stuff back, right? And so some of the stuff that can go in a book, like you wouldn't be able to get it in a peer-reviewed paper because like you can get a little more of this, maybe some people write this way in papers, but it can be hard to get more of this like reflective writing. And then in a book, you can make like a longer argument that spans several chapters. So there were little pieces that I kind of pulled out into papers, or that were just like, oh, this doesn't quite fit. Like some of the stuff about the Zoom and sugar that's in the last chapter. And then there were some things that I was like, I promised it to someone for a book, actually part of what I presented to you for a book chapter. And then I was like, no, you can't have that. Sorry, I need that for my book. Like, I don't want that just as a little thing. But it's interesting because I think most people who do books, they do have these papers that are like a little bit after. And in the epilogue of this book, I was talking a lot about my collaborations with my colleague collaborators. I'll show you guys. It's not gonna. Oh, never mind. But so a lot of the stuff around, the projects that came next, these are some of my cute pictures that were. So some of the actual new projects that are coming out of this queer trans feminist method are what's left out, and then I'm just now kind of starting to write about. In the epilogue, I talk about it a little bit. But more just like about the collaboration and like these field conversations about queerness and gender in the Kairos context, and not so much about like the science that is being produced. And so it's, I think a lot of times people are like, well, what is queer trans feminist ecology like? How is it different? What does your data sheet look like? And this is like a little bit outside of the scope of the book, although I really hope that I see other people writing that kind of stuff, and I'm writing a little bit too.
Okay, so something came up because I had a question about your.
Oh yeah.
So, first of all, do you regret not posting the photo to the Twitter account or to the Twitter page? And then that kind of leads into my second question: is there anything else that you have in your book that you changed your opinion on? Or you're like, oh, I wish that I would have said something different. Like, how are you going to move forward?
Oh, that's a really good question. I did kind of regret not doing it, but it was just like, oh, Twitter's so weird, and maybe someone's going to be super offended, and also like, is it disrespectful to post a picture of the dead? Was like another question that I had, and so. But I do have this like curiosity to like what would have people, not like I have a massive Twitter following or anything, but like, there's a few friends that kind of comment, and I was like, oh, I wonder what they would have thought, and I think any project that you work on over like 7 to 10 years, like your positions evolve, and but I don't know, it's a regret, but it is when you read it. You're like, wait, this one chapter seems really different from the other ones. And they're all kind of really different, but the one chapter that is around like the water politics and the climate in Scott Valley, like it really makes sense for me why it's in there. It's an important part of like my own scholarship, but it's not very queer, and it is feminist, but it's interesting to think about, like, if I was writing that chapter now, I'd write it really, and so that's always a part of, like, especially publishing a book or something over a long time, it's like, there's just going to be some stuff that's older that you're going to have a different feeling about. You just have to kind of get over it and be like, whatever, this has its own life, out in the world. Yeah, yeah.
So the salmon oracle, just even in the room, seeing people's response to that story, it has so much energy. And I just wonder if you have thoughts in the present about what other kind of interruptions and communications that are more timely to right now. Not that that's untimely, but what you want, either you would like to see in any level of detail or when you're.
So there's one that I was thinking about a lot just because of the smoke, and I did it last year with a friend, just at a friend's birthday party, but it was down in San Francisco and people were having a really, really hard time with the smoke. It had been there forever. And I had just come from doing a prescribed burn with a friend of mine who's a fire ecologist that day. And from working in the Klamath, their people have always burned, and they talk a lot about good fire and how we need to put good fire in the land and how this is like such a healing thing. And in that context, the smoke like registers differently. It still might hurt your lungs, but people have this good feeling about it. So it's like, how can people living in San Francisco, have a good feeling about the smoke, which is really like hard to deal with and oppressive and is like bad in some ways, but like just feeling so bad about it maybe doesn't help us cope with it. So yeah, we did this little ritual around good fire where we just did, if you light a match and if you hold it up, how it burns more slowly, and if you hold it down, it burns your hand and burns really fast. And we just talked about, good fire out on the land and how we could have more of this good fire. But also like, let's breathe in the smoke, and this is all of these plants and animals that are coming from far away that are connecting us to these landscapes. And I'm not gonna be able to recreate it right now, but it was like very powerful moment for 50 people who are at this birthday party. And then we had collected all of these plants that are fire followers, and some of them are really aromatic. And so then we had a campfire and made like a distillation, like what is it called, a hydrosol, that's like you get rose water, that's a hydrosol. So it's like, the good smells of the fire followers, and then everyone got a little bottle to like spray on them when they're feeling stressed out about the smoke. So I think these types of like public collective rituals that let us really think about like, what do we want to do about fire? Like, do we want to like have a role in putting good fire on the land? Even if we live in the city and we don't really know about it, like how, like maybe that is important to us. And so I think that made a connection, and I would love to do more stuff like that. But yeah, I really love doing stuff like that. Okay, one last question. I know we're kind of over time. It's one last. If you have to leave, it's fine. Yeah.
In your opinion, what would be the most ideal result of this queer, trans, and feminist lens in the ecological movement as a whole?
What a cool question.
That is a cool question. So what would be the ideal result of queer, trans, feminist ecology? I mean, I think there's results on different scales, and like one that I think is super important is just for people who are queer or trans and are wanting to be scientists to be like, yeah, I can do this. I don't have to hide, and I can like draw on my own experience, right? The same way that people who are not white or who are, not from this country or whatever can be like, I have, history and culture that is of value, even though it's different from the mainstream, right? And I don't want to like diminish the importance of that because it's so important. But I do think that in terms of broader environmental conservation or restoration or management, this idea that humans don't have to be like dominating other species or rivers or controlling them, and that like we can be in a different relationship of listening, of witnessing, of learning from, and of like being open to, right, making mistakes and learning from mistakes, and just not quite like so set on like planning everything out so much and controlling processes, and also in the way that we're studying to be really open to science is very powerful, right? And just the way that we can quantify and predict it's a super powerful form of knowledge. And yet, like, it's partial, it leaves out things that are outside of when were you in the field, you weren't there for 360 days out of the year, so you didn't see a lot of stuff. And so just this openness, not only to local knowledges and indigenous knowledges, but also to artistic practices or other ways of sensing and feeling. And I think that if ecology could encompass more of that, like it would both be more a nicer place to work and to live, and also more powerful in terms of what it can do in the world. So I'd be happy to stay for another hour and talk, but I know we have to run that. So thank you so much for your engagement and for coming in and and I'm sorry to Zoom people, I didn't even get to answer your questions, but